Hello and welcome to Day 10 of Carry the Fire Foundations. Over the past few lessons, we've been in a very practical phase, studying the mind, behavior, and how human beings actually work. There's much more terrain here that will be available in the future, but not in this Foundations pack. We're now ready to move to the third phase of this program. You have enough tools to move from understanding how humans work and how to master yourself to clarifying the ultimate goals and direction of your life. So it's time to get really clear on what you stand for and who you are becoming. Last lesson, we dug into cognitive biases, and you watched the psychology of human misjudgment. I hope you found that video pretty awesome. You've now seen something most people never really come to grips with. Human beings are remarkably good at deceiving ourselves. We misread reality, we rationalize our behavior, we invent stories to justify what we've already done or what we have already decided. And that realization alone has enormous implications. It points toward a host of skills that we need to study and master. These include things like communication, relationships, leadership, and lifestyle design. All of that matters, but there is an even more urgent implication to what you learned last week. Last week we saw just how susceptible we are to manipulation and to self-deception. To follow up on that, I want you to ask yourself, what lies at the root of most self-deception and poor decision making? What do you think? I'll give you some hints. It's not simply lack of discipline. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not even impulse control, though that certainly contributes. So any thoughts? What leads to the worst decisions? The single most powerful force shaping human behavior is this: the desire for social acceptance, the desire to be liked, to belong, to be seen a certain way, to fit in, to avoid disapproval and disrespect. Remember what we learned from the book Tribe about why mental health actually improves during disasters. People want to matter. In their book The Twin Thieves, Steve Jones and Lucas Jaden refer to this drive as survival brain. Your brain, and especially System 1, is built for a very specific world, a hunter-gatherer world. And in that world, what mattered most was not strength, not intelligence, but belonging. If you were rejected by the tribe, you didn't just feel lonely, you died. That means social acceptance became our deepest psychological need. And because it sits so deep, it has the power to draw out both our best behavior and our worst. Among young adults and in mainstream culture today, this often shows up in a quiet but powerful pressure not to care too much. There are always people who try to gain status by mocking those who give effort, the tryhards. They go out of their way to signal that they don't care, as if the obviously cool thing to do is just not to care. Not caring is safer. It doesn't threaten anyone. It gives you cover. If you try hard and you fail, there's no way to hide it. You can't say you weren't really trying. Everyone saw how hard you worked and how much you cared. And socially, that's a bit terrifying. That's why people often feel pressure to act like they don't care, rather than to work hard and handle their business the right way. Now understand this, these dynamics do not exist in great culture. Great cultures are built on shared purpose. Great teams reward effort, commitment, and sacrifice. Likewise, every great sports program makes it safe, even prestigious, to care deeply. In great cultures, the guy who tries to show that he doesn't care is seen for exactly what he is, someone who is deeply insecure. But in weak cultures, the need for approval keeps people afraid and small. And in people who have never reflected deeply on what they stand for, on who they are becoming, that same need can lead somewhere far darker. Because when you don't stand for anything, when you drift, when approval becomes your compass, you don't just become harmless, you become usable. And sometimes, as in the story I'm about to tell you, not caring can cost you everything. In August of 2000, 15-year-old Nicholas Markowitz was walking along a quiet road in his affluent Los Angeles neighborhood when a van suddenly pulled over. Three men in their early 20s jumped out. They beat Nicholas, blindfolded him, and threw him in the van. So the backstory is that Nicholas's older brother Ben owed a small-time drug dealer named Jesse James Hollywood $1,200. Hollywood and his crew were on their way to confront Ben, the older brother, when they saw his younger brother Nicholas walking alone. So in a moment of impulsive stupidity, they kidnapped the younger brother instead. They blindfolded him, and Nicholas is in there terrified. They drive him 70 miles north to Santa Barbara. At first, he's understandably panicked, but after Hollywood's gang explains the situation, something strange happened. They didn't lock him in a basement. They brought him to parties. They gave him alcohol. They gave him drugs, access to excitement and carefree fun, and even status. He was affectionately nicknamed Stolen Boy. Over the next 2 days, Nicholas was taken from house to house, from party to party. Later, as many as 32 people admitted they knew Nicholas had been kidnapped, but they did nothing. All right, they all knew that this was completely inappropriate, that he had been kidnapped, that he was taken against his will, but they did nothing. Why? Because he looked like he was having fun. Nicholas himself began to relax. He admired his captors, their swagger, their recklessness, their fast, consequence-free lifestyle. He was reassured repeatedly that he'd be returned home soon. He believed this would all become a wild, cool story he'd laugh about later. And the young men around him probably believed that too. They weren't hardened criminals, they were spoiled kids who thought their deviant behavior would make them look cool. The kidnapping became part of the performance, proof that they were edgy and fearless, that they just didn't care. They had just stolen a boy and now partied with him. So while the crew had fun, their ringleader Hollywood quietly met with a lawyer, and the lawyer told him kidnapping could result in life in prison. So suddenly this joke wasn't funny, and Hollywood panics. He calls Ryan Hoyt, and this kid who idolized Hollywood and owes him money, and Hollywood told Hoyt there was a way to erase his debt. He handed him a modified, fully automatic Tech-9 pistol. And after 2 days of partying, the group followed Hoyt. They drove Nicholas into the mountains overlooking Santa Barbara. They bound and gagged him. They dug a shallow grave, and then they shot him 9 times. In 2007, a film called Alpha Dog was released, and it was based on this story. I remember seeing it on opening night. I had no idea of the true story behind it. The movie does something unsettling. It makes you actually like these people. Justin Timberlake plays a character based on Hollywood's closest friend. He's charismatic, funny, and really magnetic. The early scenes feel like a typical teen party movie. The kidnapping is presented almost as a wild joke, immature, reckless, but harmless. The audience laughs a lot throughout. They cheer the party scenes, the crude jokes, the irreverent lifestyle. The whole thing lulls you into a sense of like, what's the big deal? This is just another fun party movie with a kidnapping twist. And if like me you didn't know the true story, you still expected everything to work out, until it doesn't. Suddenly Timberlake's character hits Nicholas over the head with a shovel, and then Nicholas is executed. And you could hear a pin drop in that theater. No one moved. It didn't feel real, because it wasn't supposed to end that way, at least not in the story we had been telling ourselves. But this was a real story that really happened. For days, Nicholas wasn't treated like a victim. He was brought to parties, he drank, people laughed with him, dozens of people knew he had been kidnapped and did nothing, because it didn't look that serious. It looked like he was having fun, and it's hard to be the one person who isn't being cool about everything. No one involved thought of themselves as evil. As many as 32 partiers later acknowledged that they knew Nicholas had been kidnapped, but did nothing. They were immature, status-obsessed, and deeply concerned with being accepted by this group. Stepping in and stepping up would have required caring too much, asking questions, creating tension, and risking social fallout. And that's the part that should bother us, because this dynamic isn't rare. It's very familiar. I remember a guy in college who tried to impress people by saying, "The thing about us is we don't care." As an insecure dude, he fell back on that as the best way to look cool. I wonder if you've seen the same. As a high school coach, I've seen athletes who were afraid to enforce team standards, not because they didn't know better, but because it was safer just not to care. Calling someone out felt risky. Holding the line felt uncool, or it was definitely safer not to, right? Socially safer. It's almost always easier and socially safer not to care, not to be extra, not to rock the boat, not to confront people who are living by destructive values. You do you is the mantra of our time. Caring has a cost. It risks awkwardness. It risks conflict. It risks being uncool. So most people avoid it. People could have intervened and Nicholas could have escaped, but no one wanted to pay the price of standing apart. Eventually, when the situation became inconvenient, Nicholas was driven into the mountains and he was murdered. This was not a story about monsters, however. It was a story about drift. That's what drift looks like at the individual level. So now let's zoom out. The Holocaust gives us insight into what drift looks like at the group level. After the Holocaust, people all over the world were trying to understand, how was this possible? How could that have happened? How could an entire society participate in something so evil? Why weren't there refusals all along the chain? The soldiers who carried out the violence weren't the only ones responsible. Entire populations watched as Jewish citizens were pushed out of jobs, forced into ghettos, publicly humiliated, beaten, and eventually deported. This didn't happen quietly. Neighbors noticed. Colleagues would have noticed. Entire towns watched people disappear. The scale of this atrocity required the passive cooperation of millions. So at the Nuremberg trials, Nazi officials repeatedly offered the same defense. They said, "I was just following orders." But who follows orders like that? In 1961, a political philosopher named Hannah Arendt covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat most responsible for organizing the transport of Jews to extermination camps. What shocked her wasn't his cruelty or madness. It was that he was an unexceptional, altogether typical bureaucrat. Eichmann wasn't a sadist. He wasn't brilliant. He wasn't ideologically deep. He was just a cog, happy to fit into any machine. He committed atrocities because of his mindless conformity and failure to think. As Arendt wrote, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, terribly and terrifyingly normal. In another time and place, he might have been your boring but polite neighbor. Arendt called this the banality of evil, and it was very disturbing and hard for people to accept, because people wanted to believe the opposite, that the Holocaust was only possible because of the coordination of a group of sadistic, bloodthirsty, and deeply twisted people, that there was something different about the Germans, that they could have been capable of facilitating this atrocity. But on the contrary, they were just like anyone else. Right around this time, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to test this in his famous 1963 obedience experiments. In this experiment, Milgram told participants that they were taking part in research on learning. Each person believed they were assigned to act as a teacher, delivering electric shocks to a learner every time they got an incorrect answer. In reality, the learner was an actor and the shocks were not real, though the teacher believed all of this was real. As the experiment continued, the teacher administered more and more severe shocks. The learner protested loudly and eventually went silent, yet the experimenter calmly instructed participants to continue administering shock. About 65% of participants went all the way to the highest shock levels. The study has been repeated many times with similar results. It appears that, without strong ideals, people are prone to defer responsibility to an authority figure, even going as far as to shock people to death. And history keeps confirming this pattern. From the Atlantic slave trade to the Holocaust to the Rwandan genocide, humanity is capable of terrible collective action when social proof or authority figures deem them acceptable. When standards aren't clear, people rationalize to avoid social costs. All this could make you really pessimistic about human nature, but it shouldn't. This isn't what humanity is, it is what happens in weak cultures. This is what is possible for people when people are never prepared to answer the most important questions in life. Questions like, what do I stand for? What lines will I not cross? What kind of person am I becoming? As a teacher, I used to show all my students the Milgram obedience experiment early in the year, because I wanted students to be shaken from their passivity and to begin cultivating a sense of a higher standard. It is easy to focus on the majority who deliver lethal shocks, but what about the other third or so? What gave them the moral courage to overcome their social discomfort and to say no more? Throughout history, we see people who resisted drift over and over again. Firefighters running into the Twin Towers as thousands ran out. People throughout Europe who hid Jews during World War II. Martin Luther King Jr. leading the Montgomery bus boycott, inspiring a community to willingly subject themselves to deep personal inconvenience for over a year, teaching people how not to respond when assaulted so that the world could not ignore the injustice they were being subjected to. These weren't superhumans. They were people with standards. So the problem isn't humanity. The problem is when we fail to prepare people and give them a path to character and excellence. The problem is drift and an upbringing that avoids the hard questions. What do we stand for? What are our standards, our ideals? And that is where we're going to pick up next time. Onward to the discussion. Thanks for being here. Carry the fire.